The Story of Little Suzannah by Lucy Jackson. London, 1997. I was manning the Irish Terrier stand at the London Discover Dogs exhibition when a charming woman with a strong foreign accent asked to buy one of our stuffed toy terriers. She took some time to choose and seemed deep in thought, looking at each one carefully, studying the little faces. "Is it for a grandchild?" I asked brightly. The answer came slowly. No, it's for me," she said. "You will think I'm crazy. You see, I once had an Irish Terrier when I was a child in Prague before the last war. She was my darling, my best friend. I called her Suzannah, little Suzannah. I owe her so much. Everything, really. Probably even my life. She was a wonderful, brave little dog." And this, in essence, is the story that Ola told me. Prague is a grand and beautiful city, built on both sides of the river Vltava, a tributary of the Danube. Its elegant bridges and buildings are a blend of styles spanning several centuries. It has still today historical and political importance. But in the 1920s and 30s, having been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it had strong cultural and intellectual ties with the rest of Europe. Beloved by Mozart and composers of the High Baroque period, music seems even now to live in its very stones. As the capital city of the newly independent state of Czechoslovakia, it was the centre of law, banking, commerce, and the hub of political life. There was a solid body of educated professionals to run and administer the country. Foreign money flowed in, and prosperity seemed assured. The university was one of the finest in the world, and whether in theatre, art, music and opera, or science and medicine, Prague kept up with, and often surpassed, the other famous European capitals. Life for its citizens at this point was good. Shops and businesses flourished. Traditional crafts had found a new world market. New techniques were pioneered and ancient ones revived. There were fashionable cafes and restaurants which remained open all night, where beautiful people danced and dined. But more than this was the feeling of civic and national pride, and the hopeful belief that the future of their country was secure. New areas of the city were being opened up to build houses for the emerging prosperous middle classes. These were mainly on the hills leading up to the famous castle. There were parks and formal gardens and wide streets, and most beautiful too were the natural forests and woodlands that came right up to the edge of the city. The houses were spacious and comfortable, with a limitless supply of servants to clean, cook and launder. There was luxury and ease for the well-to-do in this enviably beautiful setting. Many people had cars, and the European rail system made for a lifestyle of interest and freedom unknown before this time. Most of these wealthy families had connections with the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, and visiting relatives in Vienna, Budapest, or indeed Paris, London, Berlin or Leipzig was part of the sophisticated merry-go-round of the average upper-class European family. It was a sort of intellectual, cultural and commercial circuit shared and enjoyed by many. The Munkers were just such a family, and Olga was their only child. They lived, as one would expect, in a large, comfortable house below the castle. It was a strange mixture of every modern convenience, but with the old solid furniture and heavy brocade curtains and rugs of an earlier style. Olga, who had as a baby called herself Ola, was just 7. She should have been a happy, carefree child. It seemed she had everything she could possibly have wanted. But she was cross and bored and lonely. Nothing ever seemed to be much fun. The house, with huge porcelain ovens in every room, was hot and stuffy for a child. The double windows lined with bolsters to keep out the bitter cold of the Prague winters were seldom opened, even in summer. She wore too many warm clothes, even indoors, a dress, vest, bodice, knickers and petticoat. Heavy tweed, imported especially from England, was made into coats, skirts and gaiters. Everything was too tight, too scratchy and too thick for running about, and she envied the boys riding bicycles and playing in the street. Even in the high heat of a Prague summer, when she wanted to walk barefoot, she had to wear her long white cotton stockings. That her parents loved her dearly, she never questioned for a moment. They petted and indulged her when they did meet, but had neither the time nor inclination to play with the child. They were busy, important people. He as a director of the opera house, a director of music from the Music Conservatoire, and she as a fashionable Prague hostess, entertaining the stream of international singers and musicians passing through the city. Ola used to say, "They're always getting dressed to go somewhere." And indeed, there were days and days when she scarcely saw them at all. Often she would wave to them from the top of the stairs, her father in white tails and her mother slim and elegant in the latest Parisian fashion, as they left for the opera. "Be good, Ola. Don't worry Tetty too much." And they would drive off in the large, comfortable German Chrysler and return long after her bedtime. Tetty, whose full name was Marietta, was Ola's nurse. She was kind enough, but very strict about good manners and not playing wildly, which, for Tetty, meant anything as agitated as running or throwing a ball about. She wore a long grey dress almost down to her ankles, woolen in winter and linen in summer, and a veil rather like a nun's, which tied at the back of her head. She had been a country girl, but knew that Ola's parents required a well-behaved, quiet child with perfect manners and no rough edges, and Tetty knew it was her job to produce this paragon of virtuous conduct. They did lessons in the morning, as Ola was not yet at school, and then Tetty would sit and sew, and Ola hated sewing and had already sat still all morning anyway. They were supposed to walk each day in the park or woods round the castle, but often it was too hot, or too wet, or cold, or Tetty was tired or busy. Even when they did go out, Tetty would whisper all the time, "Don't walk too fast. Leave that dog alone. Don't lag behind. Pick up your feet. Don't scuff your shoes. Don't forget to curtsy when you say good day." Tetty was like a catalogue of hints on how to behave, and there wasn't much time to enjoy the walks or pick flowers or look at anything. Meal times were agony to Ola. Mountains of food would appear. "I can't eat all this food, Tetty." "Why not? You will. You'll never grow strong." "No, it's just too much." "Eat up, there's a good girl, or cook will be disappointed." "I can't." Poor Ola, often in tears, would sit in front of an enormous plate of soup, dumplings, roast goose or steamed fish, and long for a day when she could eat nothing at all. She tried very hard to be good-tempered and quiet, but there were times when she stamped and cried and refused to get dressed or have her hair brushed. Sometimes she would sulk for hours, saying nothing to anyone. One day, in a great rage, she pulled all her toys out of the cupboard and, to Tetty's dismay, threw them down the stairs: dollies, Teddy, tea-set, puzzles, books, balls and crayons. Even the much-loved dog, which had wheels and a handle to push, landed with a crash on his head. A wooden cart hit the banister so hard it chipped the wood and alarmed Ola enough to stop her. She burst into tears. "I'm bored, Tetty. I don't want toys. I want a friend, or a proper live dog. Why can't I ever go downstairs or into the garden alone?" Her mother was told about it, and there were grave faces. She saw it as a total breakdown of discipline, and secretly blamed Tetty for spoiling Ola. She spoke to Ola severely. "I shall have to tell St. Nicholas to bring you coal, which is for naughty children, instead of sweets. Don't forget he comes next week." "I don't want any more sweets. There are sweets everywhere, and I can't eat them all. And I don't want any more toys either. I've got 15 dolls already." "That's very naughty of you, Ola, to say that, and I shall have to speak to Tetty about you." "I want to go out. I want to play with a friend and ride a tricycle or a push scooter. And please, Mama, mostly I want a dog." "A dog? What nonsense. You've got a toy dog, and bicycles and scooters are for boys. You might fall over and hurt yourself or spoil your clothes." "A dog then, Mama? Please?" "I must go now, Ola, but I shall speak to Tetty about you. You must learn to stand still and stop fidgeting about. She must teach you that, at least." "But, Mama—" "Be quiet, Ola, and don't mention that dog again. They're dirty, noisy animals, and I will never allow one in the house. Do you understand?" Ola knew that she had made her mother angry and got Tetty into trouble. "All I want is someone to play with," she thought sadly. "Is that such a dreadful thing?" Christmas. Every year, Ola looked forward to Christmas. There would be a tall fir felled in the forest, brought in by the gardeners and set up in the hall. Ola would peep in all day as the tree was dressed with baubles and bubbles of exquisite Bohemian glass and sweets wrapped in brightly coloured paper. There were some painted wooden ornaments from Austria, which Ola was allowed to unwrap and hang on the lower branches of the tree. At the top was an angel with shiny wings and a star on her head. There were real beeswax candles, which smelt of honey, and their heat brought out the smell of pine from the tree. There was always a party on Christmas Eve, a sophisticated, grown-up party with artists from the opera house. Ola would be paraded around in her Christmas best, shaking hands and curtsying, until she was forgotten and would be gathered up by Tetty and taken to bed. But at least the house would be full of people, and sometimes they would sing, and Ola loved to listen. This momentous Christmas Eve, when Ola was 7, was the one which she would never forget. As a treat after the Mass, with her parents in the church of Our Lady, Tetty and Ola were to walk home across the cobbled square and see the Christmas market. All the church bells would be ringing, and there were groups of carolers with lanterns and pretty lights and candles everywhere. They had some parcels to collect for Mrs. Munker and were hurrying home. They crossed the Child's Bridge and looked out across the beautiful city. It started to snow, large dry flakes that floated slowly down. Ola skipped about in excitement. "Don't slip," warned Tetty. She bent down to make a snowball. "Don't get your gloves wet," said Tetty. She ran to the side of the bridge and leaned out against the balustrade, breathing in the crisp winter air. "Don't dirty your coat," said Tetty. Don't, thought Ola. "One day I will go mad." The streets were crowded with people calling out Christmas greetings to one another. Tetty was getting cross, bustling along with the parcels. "Hurry up, Ola, and be careful with those presents." They passed a pet shop, and the man in his green overall was putting the sign saying "closed" on the door. In the window, surrounded by tinsel and garish paper lanterns, sat one small, forlorn brown puppy. They had noticed her earlier with several others playing and tumbling in the straw. "Oh, Tetty, look! Why is the puppy still there? All the others have gone and the man's closing up the shop." She ran to the window and tapped on the pane. The puppy's eyes brightened, and she tried to stand up on her back legs, but bumped her nose as her front paws slid down the pane. When Ola leaned forward, the puppy bounced on her little front legs and wagged her tiny tail. They looked at each other. Ola was still as a statue, and the puppy trying desperately to reach her through the glass. It was one of those curious moments of truth when doubt does not exist and there is only one thing to be done. Ola, clear-headed and calm for the first time in her life, knew they must take her home.
"Tetty," she burst out, "we must buy that puppy. We can't leave her here. She needs us, Tetty, and I need her. Please, Tetty, please."
"What?" shrieked Tetty in disbelief. "Are you mad? What are you thinking about? You heard what your mother said. They won't let you keep her, and they will blame me. Now, come on, you silly child. And besides, I haven't any money." But Ola was not listening. She had marched straight into the shop, putting down her parcels on the counter.
"Will you take these parcels in exchange for your puppy, please? I don't know what's inside them, but I must have her, and I don't have any money."
Ola's voice faltered, and she thought she was going to cry. To her amazement, the man said kindly, "As a matter of fact, she's the last one, and I'm just shutting up. I wasn't too sure if anyone would take her. She's the littly, you see, the last of the litter, and much smaller than the others. She's a proper Irish terrier. You know the Habsburgs have them. Marvellous, tough little dogs. There's nothing wrong with her. She's sturdy enough, but just not up to size. She's got bags of character too, but I was worried about what to do with her. You'd better have her for a Christmas present. Would you like that?" Through the window, Tetty, horrified, saw Ola throw her arms round the man's neck and kiss him on both cheeks. "The child's gone mad," she thought, and rushed into the shop. She was too late. He had lifted the puppy out of the window and was handing her to Ola. "Here, hold her like this," he was saying. "Put your hand under her chest and tuck her under your arm." Ola's heart was racing. She had never held an animal before, not even a cat or a rabbit, let alone a puppy. Her hands trembled and she could hardly breathe. But the puppy was completely at home and nestled into Ola's arms as though she had always been there. When she turned her little face upwards and Ola felt the cold, wet nose and then the warm pink tongue on her cheek, she knew that nothing, but nothing in the world would part them. She did not even hear Tetty's cries of dismay as they left the shop. She walked over the cobbled streets in a state of enchantment. Time had stood still for a small girl and her puppy in a world of their own. The joy of her, the sweet brown of her, the warm puppy smell, the soft snuffles and the quick heartbeat against her hand. "I love you, I love you," whispered Ola. "I know your name is Suzannah, my little Suzannah." The child's heart was warmed. Her soul had found a mate, and she would never be lonely again. Tetty was furious and scolded and complained, warning Ola about her parents' wrath when they saw the puppy. To their surprise, however, there was very little fuss when they arrived, except that they were late and the house was already full of guests for the party. No one wanted to make a scene that evening, and not much was said. Besides, worn out no doubt by the long day at the pet shop, the puppy had fallen asleep. It was that strange deep sleep of an utterly exhausted baby animal that nothing will wake. "We'll put her in the back kitchen," said Tetty, "and we'll decide what to do with her in the morning." "Oh, no, we won't," said Ola. "Or I shall sleep downstairs with her, and there's nothing to decide anyway. She's staying here with me." Tetty, exasperated, had run out of arguments. "Take her upstairs then, but hurry up or you'll miss the party." "I don't care about the party," said Ola. "No one wants to talk to me anyway, and I don't want to talk to them." She carried Suzannah upstairs and put her on a chair, and the puppy slept on. Ola turned her over onto her back, and her legs flopped out like a rabbit. She felt her soft ears and woolly paws, and kissed the tiny face. "My darling
My darling little Suzannah, you are so sweet and funny and delicious.
Hurry up, Ola. Tetty was becoming desperate. It's nearly time for supper and you're not even dressed yet. Tetty was cross and brushed Ola's hair vigorously and tied her sash too tightly. But Ola hardly noticed. She was held in a thrall with the tiny puppy, and nothing else seemed to be real or matter at all. Ola, dressed in her finery at last, carried Suzannah downstairs. Still asleep on a cushion, with her eyes tightly shut, she placed her under the Christmas tree amongst the brightly wrapped parcels. Ola's parents were intrigued, and their guests gathered round. "She looks like a clockwork toy. Does she wind up?" said one. Ola's father, bending forward to see her, and doubtless remembering some echo from his own childhood, said gently, "No, not a toy. A real live Christmas baby." Ola was amazed to see all those tedious grown-ups stroking the puppy and asking about her. For the first time in her life, she had something to say, and told them again and again about the puppy left alone in the shop window and the kind man who said she was the Littly. Quite suddenly, one more time, quite suddenly, pink, Suzannah opened her eyes. She looked astonished for a moment, then yawned and stretched out on her side. It didn't take long before she was properly awake and running about, skidding across the floor, rolling up the edges of the Persian rugs and bumping into things. She raced back to her cushion, clambered up, then launched herself off in an immense four-legged leap, followed by a body roll and back onto her feet. She was delighted with herself and streaked off behind the Christmas tree. Ola watched horrified as a large golden puddle appeared, but Tetty rushed for a sponge, and everyone pretended not to notice. They started opening presents, and Suzannah joined in with enthusiasm, crashing through piles of tissue paper, turning over and over. "What a madcap you are," laughed Mrs. Munker. "You wouldn't think she had just arrived, would you?" "She's so fearless and so funny," said Ola's father. "Do you think she knows she's making us laugh?" Suzannah had them all in stitches again. She found a long silver satin ribbon amongst the wrapping paper and ran about trailing it behind her. She held her head high, but kept tripping herself up and falling over with her legs in the air. She'd start reorganising things again with tremendous concentration, only to tip over once more, 4 feet in the air. She was whizzing round the tree and spotted one of Ola's painted ornaments. With a great deal of effort and tugging and squealing, she managed to dislodge it. She paraded it like a trophy for all to see, her little legs stiff with importance. She would not give it up, and had to find exactly the right spot to tuck it safely away before dashing back to play. Everyone was enchanted with her, more probably as some clever animated toy than a living creature with a reality of her own. Ola knew, however, that when her father patted Suzannah's head and asked her name and said, "See you look after that puppy, Ola. Ask cook about her food and let her rest properly," he had given his consent to her staying. Her heart was joyful as she helped Tetty make a bed in the old wicker laundry basket and tucked her in. Ola started to sing a lullaby her Austrian grandmother had taught her. "Hiya, hiya, hiya," gently stroking the puppy, who closed her eyes almost at once. "Tetty, I'm so happy. And you've been laughing too, haven't you?" "Maybe," said Tetty. "Now, off to bed." When Ola was asleep, Tetty tiptoed into her room to peep at the sleeping puppy. She rubbed her chest and tickled her tummy. Suzannah, still sound asleep, rolled over onto her back. She picked her up and steadied the limp small body against her shoulder, tucking her head under her chin. She heard the little grunt of pleasure as Suzannah half opened her eyes. A strange tenderness filled Tetty's heart, and as she put her gently back, she sighed and smiled. Oh my, oh my, I think I'm falling in love with you, little sleepy one. Suzannah learnt very quickly what the household was about. She knew her name at once and where she slept and how to get down to the garden. She knew that Olla was her best person. I'm her mistress, Olla would like to tell everyone, and that Tetty was her second person. She knew that food came from cook and would escape downstairs and arrive full of delight at finding her in the kitchens. There were 3 pretty young housemaids who adored her. She would jump up and catch the streamers from their caps, or run off with their feather dusters, leaving a trail of feathers down the stairs. But no one was ever cross. They retrieved her treasures, some more savoury than others, which she had stashed away behind the cushions and curtains. They organised regular hunting parties to find lost shoes or brushes, with Suzannah standing by saying, "Oh, there it is." The gardeners raked over the holes she dug in the gravel drive, or precious rose beds, and laughed when they told Olla about it. Most extraordinary of all to Olla was that she found her parents' bedroom. She had slipped in one morning under the maid's feet as she was carrying a large jug of hot water. She had bounced around the bed and insisted on being lifted up onto the large 4-poster. There she rolled about and played and burrowed under the silk-embroidered covers. Olla and Tetty, standing respectfully in the doorway, would laugh to see her being fussed over and petted by 2 such unlikely people. She popped in most mornings, and when she failed to appear, they would send for her. "What is it about Suzannah," Olla asked Tetty one day, "that makes us all so happy?" "I think I know," said Tetty. "She makes us happy because she makes us love her. It's a sort of magic. We'll have to call it Suzannah's magic." Olla was right. It was as if the large, gloomy house had come alive. Instead of the air of hushed formality, people laughed together and swapped Suzannah's stories. "Did you hear about this morning? Such a deep bark for a little dog." "Only 1 puddle today. She went up and down the big staircase all by herself. She knows our names, and when cook said—" "She had a ride in the car. She's so clever, she's so quick, she's so sweet." If the household had become more cheerful, it was nothing compared with the change in Olla. Suzannah woke with the birds, bright-eyed as the day. Olla, who had never been good at getting out of bed, found herself playing tug with her dressing-gown cord even before breakfast. She had never been allowed to romp about and was rather cautious and slow, but with Suzannah racing down the long passages, Olla could not but help joining in. They had a favourite game, which was jumping up onto the old horse-chair sofa and bouncing about. Olla discovered she could tip herself up against the back with her feet in the air. Her skirt always fell over her head, which made Suzannah think she'd lost her somewhere. "I'm here, you silly goose," Olla would laugh, tipping upright again, with Suzannah kissing her face with relief. They gave the poor old sofa a rough time of it. Suzannah tugged out the big flat studs that held the leather cover in place. It required some application, but she learned the knack, and out they'd pop. "Help!" said Olla. "We'll be in trouble." But Tetty found a way of pushing them back with a bent hairpin to fix them. "One day we'll be discovered," she said, "when the whole thing falls apart, and you'll have to make some excuses, Suzannah." Suzannah, like all puppies, grew fast. The black fluff on her face and ears fell out, and her woolly baby coat became smoother and coarser. Her nose lengthened, and by the summer she was looking more like a terrier and less like a teddy bear. Miraculously, one day her ears popped up on her head. Well, sometimes they did, even if she kept forgetting, and they would land up, as Tetty would say, here and there, one up and one out to the side. Well, she's listening, was Ola's explanation. Her needle-sharp teeth fell out as she chewed and chewed. She's such a busy little thing, said Tetty. She pulled all the socks out of that bottom drawer and threw them about. Yes, and chewed a few, thought Ola, which I've stuffed away out of sight at the back of the drawer. Mrs. Munker had brought a box upstairs with some special toys, an old slipper, a rubber ball, and a piece of rope. She came upstairs frequently now to play with Ola and Suzannah. You're very good, Suzannah, at taking things out. But how about putting them back? She laughed. She has to show you, said Ola, and now she does bring the ball back sometimes, but always drops it just out of reach, added Tetty. Suzannah had been the easiest puppy, clever, quick, and willing to learn, and an absolute charmer, except for one thing. She refused point blank to walk on a lead. Dr. Munker had arrived home one day and said he'd been to the pet shop to officially buy Suzannah. The man remembered all about her at once and remarked that though she was small, she was a real little cracker. He didn't want to take any money, but I insisted, and he gave me this small collar and lead, he said, as a present for her. Ola was delighted. I'm your real mistress now, she said. Look, Suzannah, here's your collar, and she slipped it on. Doesn't she look smart and so grown up? They attached the lead, but then the trouble began. Nothing would persuade her to walk on it. She pulled and jerked her head about, sitting back on her haunches, digging in her feet, and growing frantic. What is it, Suzannah? Why don't you like your lead? Come on now. They coaxed it and scolded. They tried bribery. They tried leaving her upstairs, then carried her down, but she lay on her back and grew more obstreperous. They tried practising in the garden, but it was hopeless. It's no use, said Ola. She hates it. She won't be tied up. She doesn't need to be. Well then, she can't go out of the garden, said Tetty sensibly. But she'll walk with me, said Ola. You'll see. And Ola had been right. Tetty was anxious at first, but soon realised that Suzannah never lost sight of them for a moment, and one call brought her back to Ola's side. They stopped worrying about her. In her entire life, whether walking on the crowded pavements, or along the riverbanks, or in the woods, or even through the terrible war years when they had to flee through the forest, Suzannah walked free. Suzannah loved her walks. No question of ever missing a day now. She'd be ready and waiting, bursting to get out, jumping up and leading the way. She greeted everyone in the park, old friends, new friends, wagging her tail and wriggling with delight. Ola, who had always walked stiffly beside Tetty and spoken to no one, was overcome at first. But very soon she was running with her hoop or her skipping rope, or dashing ahead with Suzannah to jump out at Tetty from behind a tree. The walks they loved most were through the woods which surrounded the city. Suzannah soon learned every path and where it led. Tetty would often rest in the shade while Ola and Suzannah ran off through the trees. Ola always thought they were lost, but with the words, "Find Tetty," Suzannah would miraculously lead them back. "Where were you?" Tetty said crossly. Ola, laughing, would answer, "I've no idea, but Suzannah knows, so I couldn't be lost with her, now could I?" Ola started school at last, and with Suzannah at her side, she walked through the school gates without a tremble. Suzannah's supreme confidence seemed to have rubbed off on her, and the shy, withdrawn child had become almost as chatty and robust as her little companion. Suzannah had assumed she would be going into school too, and had to be carried home, wriggling and protesting. But she was there with Tetty at the gate when the children came out. She jumped about on her hind legs with her eyes shining. She had a new trick too.
"Look, she's smiling,"
the children said. And indeed she was. She shook her head about, pulled back her lips, showed her teeth, and smiled. Whenever, after that, she was especially pleased or especially wanting to please, she would smile and make everyone laugh. Suzannah was growing at last. She would always be small for an Irish terrier, but she was strong and utterly fearless. There was a guard dog, a huge black Doberman called Hals, with ears snipped into points and a heavy chain attached to his collar. He came with Yannick, the night watchman, and left in the early morning, having patrolled the gardens through the night. One morning, however, Yannick was a little late having his breakfast in the back kitchen and had left the dog on his long chain in the garden. Suzannah, let out for her first walk, went straight towards him. Hals gave 2 huge leaps and pinned her to the ground. She lay as still as a stone. Ola almost died of fright. Terrified of the dog herself, she thought he must have killed Suzannah. But no, after a pause, no doubt while she gathered her breath, there was a wriggle and a burst of indignation as she scrambled to her feet. She was incensed, standing 4 square, head and tail up, barely reaching his shoulder, but spitting fury. She was at bay, and Hals knew it. He backed off, looking astonished, never taking his eyes off her. But Suzannah loved to play, and her natural good spirits got the better of her temper. She started bouncing on her front legs and jumping towards him, inviting him to play. She knew exactly how far the chain reached and stayed just beyond it.
"Tetty, come and see," called Ola. "Suzannah's playing with Hals. She's not afraid of him at all, even though he jumped at her. He doesn't know what to make of it. He looks rather silly."
Suzannah put on a bravura performance. She zigzagged about, changing direction at full tilt. She skimmed in and out, showing off every trick she knew, turning and jumping, appearing and disappearing from behind shrubs and flower beds. Hals sat down in the end, looking bemused and giddy, and trying to wag his short tail. Quite suddenly, Suzannah stopped, and, eyeing him carefully, she moved slowly towards him. One small brown face and one large black face met, nose to nose. Suzannah bent forward on her front legs in a deep bow and rolled over onto her back. Hals was bewitched.
"It's Suzannah's magic," explained Ola to Yannick. "She makes everyone love her."
They met and played for a while on most mornings, and it was a rare treat for a fierce working dog and his keeper, and one they would never forget. Suzannah was fully grown by the time she was 2. She was compact and strong, but racy and full of fun and energy. She'd been very well with no puppy problems at all, but one morning, instead of the joyous leap onto Ola's bed, she lay quietly curled up in her basket. "What is it, Suzannah? Are you not well?" Tetty patted her head. Suzannah hardly stirred. Her eyes were dull, and her nose was hot and dry, but running from one nostril. "Oh, my God," cried Tetty. "Come quickly, Ola. Suzannah is ill." Tetty was a farmer's daughter and had seen enough sick working dogs to recognise the signs of the dreaded distemper. The vet came and confirmed Tetty's worst fears. Suzannah was desperately ill. Her gums were white, and she had bouts of panting and a shuddering fever, after which she would lie as still as death. Ola was distraught and weeping. "Oh, Tetty,
If Suzannah dies, I shall die too."
"There's no telling with distemper," said the vet, "but she's young and strong and basically sound. Come on, Ola. You have to help Tetty look after her." He showed them how to sponge her ears and paws with cool water to keep her fever down. He trickled glucose water into the side of her mouth from a spoon and suggested giving her egg mixed up with a dash of brandy every 3 hours, day and night. "Keep her very quiet," he warned. But there was nothing else he could do. The disease had to take its course.
"I'll stay with her, Tetty. I couldn't possibly sleep."
They put a mattress on the floor beside her basket, and desperate and anxious, they nursed her for 3 terrible nights and days. Mrs. Munker tried to help, but her tears distressed Ola, and she kept calling for the vet, who could do no more than they. Sometimes Suzannah seemed a little stronger, and their hopes would soar, only to be dashed when the shivering returned. Ola realised fully, for the first time during those dreadful nights, how much she loved Suzannah, and how much joy she had brought to them all, and her distress was unbearable. "If you can pull her through the first 3 nights, she's got a fair chance," the vet had told them. They counted the hours, ticking them off, aching for Suzannah to last 1 more, and 1 more. They lit a candle and prayed for her, Tetty and Ola kneeling beside her basket. The whole household waited, stricken with grief as the little dog fought for her life. On the 4th morning, as suddenly as it had struck, the disease seemed to disappear. The fever had passed. Ola woke after a brief sleep to find Suzannah sitting up in her basket. She had drunk her water and was anxious to go out into the garden. She tried to stand up, but her legs wobbled, and they carried her out into the spring sunshine. Everyone came running. The cook with her apron up to her eyes, the maids clapping, and Mrs. Munker calling out in delight, Hals and Yannick standing to attention and both beaming. But Ola's father lifted Suzannah up in his arms and said, "My dear, dear little dog, please don't ever be ill again. I couldn't bear it." Suzannah was quickly well. "An excellent recovery," the vet pronounced. But Ola continued to look thin and tired. She would hardly allow Suzannah out of her sight, and there were nights when she grew anxious and too agitated to sleep. She would get up and coax Suzannah onto her bed and hold her tightly, worrying that her nose was dry and she might be ill again. "Don't let anything happen to you, Suzannah," she pleaded. Ola felt that a shadow had passed over her life, a dreadful premonition perhaps, and she needed time to shake it off. Mrs. Munker's parents were Austrian. Her father sadly had died in the Great War, but every summer, to escape the heat of Prague, Ola, Tetty and Suzannah would spend weeks with Grandma in the beautiful Salzkammergut mountains. Ola had been nervous of the farm animals and worried about having to speak German. Suzannah broke all the rules and was always so funny and full of herself that Ola had no chance any more of being shy. Grandma called them both Liebchen, which means darling. "I may as well have one name for the 2 of you because you are always together," she said, laughing. They had loved every minute of the holidays, and this year in particular, the clear mountain air and freedom to do as they pleased had restored Ola's health and good spirits. They climbed up the easy slopes of the valley, listening for the cowbells. "That's Ulrika, that's Annalisa, that's Hannelore," and they could recognise them all from the clink, clink, clank of the cowbells. "It's strange to think that people ski down these slopes in the winter," thought Ola. "I always see them lush, green and strewn with flowers." They called in the goats, "Le-le-le-le-le," in a high-pitched yodel, and Ola, stick in hand, would guide them proudly through the gate. Suzannah learnt quickly that she'd be in disgrace if she chased them, and would stand still, shaking with excitement. She always threw herself at the gate as it snicked shut, just to make a point, as Grandma said. Grandma's summer house, for she lived in Vienna in the winter, was made of pinewood and looked as if it was out of a picture book. The furniture matched the stairs and the shutters with painted flowers in red and yellow. Everything was light and bright and spotless, and smelt of pine and soapsuds. "Don't you love it here, Suzannah?" said Ola, hugging her. "I do." There was time in the long summer evenings to lie on the grass and listen to Grandma singing indoors as she cooked supper for them all. Ola knew the songs and would join in with the choruses. "Everything tastes so good here. Look at you, little plump Suzannah, and even Teddy's cheeks are pink." Ola had been shy of the village children, convinced that her imperfect German would make them laugh. But Suzannah loved children and had no such qualms. She always stopped to chat and wag her tail and peer into the low wicker prams to surprise the babies. Ola never knew quite how, but suddenly she seemed to have friends everywhere. "It's Suzannah's magic," she said. The village children would arrive at Grandma's door and be given lemonade and apple strudel, and then set off up the mountain, taking Ola and Suzannah with them. They were strong, athletic children who skied all winter and hiked all summer, as Teddy said. They had no time for complaints about being tired or lazy, and Ola was soon as fit and energetic as they were. Jörg and Lisa were their special friends, and they would sing and yodel and play the zither. They often walked and picnicked high up the mountainside, eating delicious sausage and gherkins and Grandma's star-shaped honey biscuits. They drank the clear spring water that babbled out from every crack in the rock faces. One day, a crowd of them climbed the lower slopes of the famous Zimnitz mountain and pointed out to Ola the chamois, or mountain goats, as they leapt from the high rocks, landing with all 4 feet perched on a pinnacle. They hunted for edelweiss, but had to settle for making a posy for Grandma from the poppies and gentians on the lower slopes. Suzannah had amazed the children. "Let's pretend we're lost," they said, "and see if Suzannah can lead us home." Of course she did, in no time at all, finding in fact the exact path by which they had climbed on the way out. "We'll give you a mountain scout badge, and that's a great honour," they said. They rubbed some special hiker's ointment into her paws, which looked red and sore. "Now, no more dancing for you tonight, Suzannah," they all laughed, and made a great fuss of her. The children danced in the late afternoons in the village square. The girls wore their dirndls and plaited their hair, and the boys wore their best leather trousers. Old Peter, who looked just like Father Christmas, played his accordion, and the children skipped and clapped their hands in a circle dance and stamped the rhythm with their feet. They were simple dances and easy to learn. Suzannah loved to join in, darting about under their feet or bobbing in the middle. Jörg said one afternoon, "Suzannah's my partner for the polka." He picked her up and whisked her round the square. 1, 2, 3, hop, 1, 2, 3, hop. People threw silver shillings at them and clapped, and Ola was furious when Teddy forbade her to pick them up. "Don't worry," Jörg whispered. "We'll come and collect them later." On warm days, they'd swim in the cold, clear water of the lake, wading in from a little sandy beach. "Let's swim out to the boat," Lisa said. "The water's so clear you can see the fish at the bottom." Ola had to confess that she couldn't really swim in deep water. "Suzannah and I have never tried, you see." They made an elaborate plan to suspend her by a rope from the jetty, just to give her the feel for proper swimming. Of course it didn't work, and Ola, shouting and splashing, thought she was drowning. Suzannah leapt in, swimming out with just her ears, eyes and nose showing above the water to rescue Ola. Jörg said she looked like an enormous rat and quite as fast. With Suzannah alongside, Ola calmed down at once
and they pulled her into the sandy beach. "What an amazing little dog you are. Who taught you to swim, Suzannah?" "She's not just a mountain scout," said the children. "She's a lifesaver as well." They laughed and cheered as Suzannah, well aware that she had done something heroic, gave a sparkling performance of acrobatic rolls and dives, drying herself on the grass tuffets. "Is she making us laugh on purpose?" asked York. "Oh, yes," said Ola, "and she's laughing too." And sure enough, Suzannah was shaking her head and showing her teeth, putting on her best smiles for them all. The years passed quickly, and Ola and Suzannah were even more devoted friends. "I'm sure Suzannah knows what I'm thinking, even before I've thought it myself," Ola used to say. She was nearly 13 now, and growing up fast. Like her parents, she was musical, and spent hours practicing the piano, with Suzannah sitting beside her on the duet stool, or asleep under the piano. To her Austrian grandmother's delight, she could sing like an angel and play the guitar and the zither certainly as competently as York and Lisa. She'd grown strong and confident, clever at her schoolwork, and more than able to keep up with skating, rounders, gymnastics, tennis, and anything else that her school friends did. It was difficult even for Tetty to remember the shy, pale-faced little girl of her early childhood. She made her first communion and insisted on having her picture taken in her white veil, with Suzannah by her side with a lace handkerchief on her head, which made Dr. Munker laugh. "I wonder," said Mrs. Munker one day, as she stroked Suzannah's head, "whether we quite realise how much we owe Suzannah. She really changed everything about our lives. We were so busy and serious before that Christmas Eve when you brought her home. Is that already 6 years ago? Are you 6, little Suzannah? She made us laugh so much. She taught us to laugh." "Yes," said Ola, "and she made me run about and play, and stopped me from sulking and whining, and she made friends for me with everyone, even Hals and Yannick, and she made Tetty less strict. And I remember when Suzannah was ill that Tetty cried as much as I did. But mostly she made me happy." "You've been a little pickle too, Suzannah, haven't you? How many holes have you dug? How many buttons have you pulled off the sofa? And how many shoes and gloves have you buried, I wonder?" Mrs. Munker was laughing. "What about the time she managed to suck the sherbet out of the sweets on the Christmas tree? Not a grain of sugar on the floor and no torn paper, but just empty packets, slightly damp, but still hanging there." Suzannah looked embarrassed. "I'm sure she knows what you're talking about," said Ola. Dr. Munker came in, and Suzannah leapt up to greet him. "Are they teasing you, Suzannah? Pay no attention, because you and I think you're just wonderful." "But so do we," said Ola and Mrs. Munker together, and they all laughed again. No one had told Ola about the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. She heard the name for the first time one summer in Austria. She had felt that things were different, almost as she and Suzannah had leapt joyfully out of the car after the long journey from Prague. Grandma, usually so smiling, looked grave and worn. It seemed that Austria was about to be liberated by the Nazis. "The people have gone mad," she said, and Ola could not believe the cold anger in her voice. "They have invited them to come marching in. Vienna is insufferable, and it's no better here. Those terrible Nazi flags everywhere." Ola had no idea what it all meant, but she and Suzannah walked down into the village, and there were flags and banners everywhere. Ola had no idea what it all meant, but she and Suzannah walked down into the village, and there were flags and banners everywhere. She wondered what the strange sign could be. It was stuck on walls and in all the shop windows, and matched the flags. "It's a swastika, the Nazi symbol," said her old friend Herr Gruner, who sold pretzels in the street. "God knows where it will all end."
Ola heard that Jörg and Lisa had been organised into a Nazi youth group with all the other children in the village. "But where are they, Grandma?" she asked. "Oh, marching about waving banners," said Grandma bitterly. "You'll see them soon enough." That afternoon, Ola and Suzannah watched their friends march down the quaint, pretty main street towards the square. Jörg was at the front, carrying a banner and walking with his knees straight, his legs jutting out on each step. Why in the world is he doing that? She wondered. She recognised several other friends, but no one smiled, though Suzannah jumped about wagging her tail. "Stand still, Suzannah," said Ola sharply. "They're concentrating so hard they haven't time to play with us today." She followed them down to the square, and Ola heard for the first time the terrible chorus of "Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil," repeated over and over, while hands everywhere shot up in front in the infamous Nazi salute. Grandma's right. They are all mad, she thought. And how ridiculous they look. What are Jörg and the other boys thinking about? But when the girls arrived in their pretty dirndls carrying baskets of flowers with trailing ribbons attached, she clapped with everyone else. The two groups met and formed into a choir on the church steps. Ola, who loved to sing, was thrilled by it all and was completely carried away by the music. They were beautiful children singing in harmony on a perfect summer day. Ola thought she might join them and sing in the chorus too. Her grandmother was furious when she mentioned it quite casually. "Keep away from those people, Ola. Don't have anything to do with them." "But Grandma, they're our friends. You know Jörg and Lisa." "I won't have you marching about like a fool, and forget about that choir. They're singing Nazi propaganda songs. Can't you hear the words? Don't you realize what Mein Führer means? They're talking about Hitler." Ola, alarmed and saddened at having made her grandmother so angry for no reason she could understand, quietly called Suzannah and crept up to bed. Inexplicably, her parents arrived within days, bringing Tetty with them. It all seemed so strange as they left again for Prague the next day. "What on earth is the matter with everyone?" whispered Ola to Tetty. "I don't know what Suzannah and I have done to Grandma, but she keeps weeping, and we're so sad too." "Your father will speak to you later," Tetty whispered. "Don't worry them now." All through that long drive home, Ola held Suzannah on her lap, stroking her and trying to comfort herself, wondering what the strange silence was all about. Her father explained briefly to Ola about the Nazis and their persecution of the German Jews. He said the fear now was that they would invade other European countries. There were many Germans in Czechoslovakia who might welcome them, as indeed they had in Austria. "We're all desperately worried, Ola. Many of our best musicians in Prague are Jews, and they are already leaving for France and England. They have to get the right papers and have connections elsewhere before they can go. And every day this is becoming more difficult. We must do everything we can to help them. They are our friends and colleagues. It is appalling and unbelievable that they have been forced into this position." Ola noticed for the first time how tired and careworn her father seemed. She hugged him and said, "Tell me what to do." "Nothing. Nothing, Ola. You and Suzannah are a joy to us. We couldn't leave you in Austria. That's why Grandma was weeping. You are half Austrian, and they might have made it difficult to get you back to Prague. How could we manage without Grandma's Liebchens here with us?" He tried to smile, but Ola could see despair in his face. She understood very little of what he was saying, and like any child with no real grasp of what was happening, she was quickly absorbed again with school and her music lessons. "Tetty, I think you're Suzannah's nurse now, not mine. I'm always so busy."
Oh, no, I'm not. I don't look after Suzannah. She looks after me. Little bossy boots. Besides, she knows you're her real mistress. She doesn't bother to listen to me. Tetty laughed and patted her. Ola became aware of meetings in the house late at night, with quiet conversations and people coming and going. There were bundles of blankets and clothes stacked in the hall. She often heard children's voices and a baby's cry, and the car leaving at speed through the gate. Sometimes, sitting at the piano for an early morning practice, she would see her father returning in the car, white with exhaustion, and wondered if he had been driving all night. She cried bitterly one evening when she was called downstairs to say goodbye to their dear old Mr. Malt. He had been such a good friend to the family. Now, we're all so proud of you, Ola. What a wonderful musician you are, already, and only 13. And his eyes were full of tears as he bent over to kiss her hand, and she curtsied to him. Give my love to that little Suzannah. Is she still keeping you on your toes? He was gone, and Mrs. Moncur, who loved him dearly, having known him all her life, wept inconsolably. How will we manage without him? He was here when you were born, Ola, and such a dear, kind man. Another friend from the university came. There are many Jews desperate to leave, he said. I wish I could help them, but it is already almost impossible to get the right papers. I am fortunate in that I'm going to lecture in Paris, and I will simply not come back. Things are becoming impossible here. Jewish businesses are being closed, shops damaged, and people shouting abuse in the streets. What is the world coming to? And I see worse things ahead. I think the Nazis will walk into Sudetenland and be welcomed by the Germans there, and then they'll invade the rest of Czechoslovakia, and the rest of Europe too. Dr. Munker said, I hope you're exaggerating, Professor Grunwald, but be assured that we will do everything we can to help your people. They are our friends, and after all, they are Czech too. These were to prove fatal words and have terrible consequences for the Munker family in the years ahead. They all shook hands. For God's sake, be careful. No one is safe. This Hitler is a madman, and this is only the beginning. And this charming, brilliant, educated man left the house shaking and tearful, hounded out by his own country, forced to flee simply because he was a Jew. Olya felt the rising anxiety in the house, but for the moment there was little change in her daily life. The school hours were longer, and there was less time to play with Suzannah. Her beloved piano teacher, who was Jewish, disappeared without warning. They hoped he had escaped to Paris. But who knew? Ola was stricken with sadness. She had become an accomplished pianist and performed at several public soirees. She'd had a great ovation when she played and sung some of her own compositions, and there was talk of further study at the Paris Conservatoire. Suzannah tolerated the music, but, bored with the long hours of practice, she would often spend time in the garden with Hals and Yannick, pretending to keep guard too. You'll never make a guard dog, Suzannah, if you welcome everyone who comes, and if you won't wear a lead, let alone a chain, Yannick teased her, pretending to put a rope on her collar. But he and Hals loved Suzannah, and enjoyed her cheerful company at night in the dark garden. How the unthinkable happened is part of history. Ola, looking back, could never quite decide whether she had the sequence of events in the right order in her mind or not. There was a rising panic amongst the Jewish communities throughout the country. Everyone who had any means of getting away fled, but thousands were left, trapped by the lack of papers and documents. The Germans occupied, liberated they called it, Sudetenland,
and were welcomed by hysterical crowds shouting "Sieg Heil" and placing garlands of flowers round the soldiers' necks. Austria was just as pro-Nazi, and Grandma wrote of her despair and hatred of them. In Prague, the politicians struggled to maintain some sort of calm. There were rallies and marches. Patriotic speeches were made in Wenceslas Square, and thousands of Czechs were out in the streets, and the churches were full of people praying for peace and lighting candles. There was hope, more than hope. There was a belief that Britain at least would come to the aid of a small country pitched against the might of Nazi Germany. Surely they would never dare to invade. No one could pretend for one moment that Czechoslovakia alone could keep them out. But feverish diplomatic negotiations went on behind the scenes, stalling for time, hoping always to appease Hitler. Ola and her parents stood in the cobbled square in the front of St. Vitus Cathedral, listening to Hacker speak. He spoke of Czech pride and their great cultural heritage, their right to keep their hard-won independence. They cheered him to the sky. With hearts overflowing, they sang, "Where is my homeland?" the Czech hymn, and many people wept. There was talk of courage, of fighting to the last man, of the skill and patriotism of the Czech army and air force. The words, "Never surrender," echo again and again around the square. A terrible reality was dawning on Ola. She understood at last her grandmother's tears and the look of haunted exhaustion on her father's face. This was another world, full of menace and totally alien to anything she had known. They watched the ancient clock with a skeleton Time nodding and pointing his finger, and Ola wondered how many times she and Suzannah had raced across the old-time square to be in time to laugh and shiver as the hour struck. There was a new and sinister meaning now. The church bells all over Prague began to ring. This was not a chime, but each single great bell beating and ringing out a terrible warning of danger and death. "Quick," said Dr. Munker. "We must get home. It could be a trial run, but the bells are a signal that the Nazi invasion has begun." They struggled through the crowds of fearful people, all desperate to leave the streets and reach the relative security of home. They paused for a moment, halfway across the Charles Bridge, and Dr. Munker, looking back towards the beautiful city, murmured, "Oh, my beloved Prague, how can we do this to you? It will be suicide. If we try to fight, nothing will be left." The next day, the invasion began. Tetty had tried hard to persuade the Munkers to move out of the city and go to her brother's farm. "It will be safer there," she had said. Mr. Munker's work kept him in Prague, and Tetty could only guess at how much help he was giving the Prague musicians, many so desperate to leave. Once the invasion started, it was too late anyway. How the Germans poured across the border and how Prague was occupied is part of the terrible history of the Nazi war. Tanks, guns, armoured cars and marching soldiers paraded in vast public spectacles in Wenceslas Square. But for its inhabitants, the breakdown of services, light, water, electricity, the horror and the terror, the humiliating sense of defeat of the German occupation, and the increasing shortage of food which brought them to the brink of starvation, is an ongoing nightmare for those who survived, even to this day. The Munkers stay on in their large house, and behind the high walls and iron gates they seem to escape the daily aggravation of insolent Nazi soldiers at every corner. Ola, with a child's confidence in the adults around her, fretted and worried more about the closure of her school and not being able to go out with Suzannah than the political chaos around her. Only Tetty had remained with the family. Everyone else had either fled or been conscripted into some service for the German occupation. Yannick and Hals had been sent to guard a roadblock on one of the main roads out of the city. "I hate these people," he said bitterly. "But what can I do? At least Hals is fed. Otherwise he would have been shot. For God's sake, keep Suzannah hidden. There are no dogs and cats allowed in the city." Tetty toiled all day looking for food for them. A loaf of bread here, a cabbage there, a speck of butter, a shred of bacon. She contrived every which way to make a meal for the family, but the pallor and loss of weight was more apparent by the day, and Suzannah was a little bag of bones. The arrest of Ola and her parents seemed to follow the classic pattern of any stage drama about the Nazis. It was a winter evening, a girl playing the piano with a dog curled at her feet, and her parents quietly listening. The clang of the iron gates as they were forced open, the car drawing up, the crunch of boots on the frosty gravel, and the loud banging on the front door. There were no explanations, and very few words spoken. "Family Munker, forward, march, in the name of the Führer." There was no time to take anything, not even a warm coat. Ola, hysterical, had clung to Suzannah, pleading to take her with them. "Be quiet, you stupid girl. She'll be shot at the gate," the officer replied. "Hurry up, get out." And with rifles in their backs, they were pushed into the car, and the doors slammed closed. Ola screamed, "Tetty, take Suzannah. For God's sake, look after her, Tetty, with your life. Please, Tetty, please." And her voice died on the night air. "I promise. On my life, I promise." And they were gone, with a shriek of tyres as the car sped through the gate. It had all happened so fast that Tetty, strangely calm, started to tidy up, as though they had gone out for the evening and would be back later. She closed the piano and folded the music and straightened the cushions on the sofa. She sat down feeling light-headed and lifted Suzannah up onto her lap. "Don't cry, little one," for Suzannah was whining softly. "They may be back in the morning. We'll keep each other company. You're frozen too." But as they sat through the night in the dark, empty house, she realised the horror and enormity of what had happened. That it was their work at the opera house and the escape of so many Jewish musicians which had led to the arrest was of little doubt. It had been an open secret from the start. Dr. Munker, with his influence and connections in the city, had never hesitated to use every channel he could. But why now? What had triggered the arrest? Who had given the word? Would she herself be implicated? The family were known as active Czech patriots. Dr. Munker's brother was president of the council, which had promoted Czech music, art and theatre with astonishing success. The Nazis despised everything but German culture, and he would have been a marked man too. Tetty knew instinctively that she was in mortal danger and must move carefully. She would have to go into hiding with Suzannah and try simply to survive. At first light in the morning, she crept around the house, closing up the shutters and locking every door and window. She drew the curtains and put covers over the furniture. Suzannah sat, looking pathetically anxious on Ola's bed, as cupboards were closed and rugs rolled up around her. She was curiously quiet, moving only her eyes, which never left Tetty for a moment. Tetty was terrified by every sound. almost paralysed with fear at the footsteps in the street, in case it should be the soldiers returning. She folded up the blankets and feather cover from Ola's bed. "You can have these to sleep on, my little Suzannah. You and I are going to live like mice in the cellar. We'll have to be very quiet, and only God knows what we'll eat." And Tetty felt panic and despair rising in her heart. Suzannah and Tetty survived somehow in the lower cellar for 2 freezing winters. Suzannah caught the rats, and they ate every sort of edible plant they could find at night in the garden. Yannick, whenever he could, left food for them just inside the iron gates, but it was scarcely enough to keep a bird alive, and it had to come out of his meagre rations. That Tetty was being hunted, she had no doubt. The soldiers had returned almost at once after the monkers were seized and smashed up the house. Tetty and Suzannah, rigid with fear, had heard the loud voices and laughter as doors and windows were beaten into fragments. Lorries drove up, and the house was emptied of everything of any value. Tetty found the door to another cellar, which was even darker and damper, but hidden behind some old mouldy wooden wine racks. "We'll be safer here, Suzannah. They'll never find us here." And the months dragged on. So many times Tetty had thought of giving herself up. Suzannah's suffering was as real as her own, and she wondered how she could justify putting her through so much. It might be kinder to them both if she ended it all. But something in Suzannah's face told her she must go on. She led her out briefly into the garden at night, and often Suzannah would return with snails or worms and lay them down so triumphantly at Tetty's feet. The odd toy would surface, having been buried for years, and a small party shoe that had been Ola's, deposited and kept with much delight by them both. "I struggle on, only because of you, Suzannah," she said so many times. And she thought with despair of the precious child to whom she had made this solemn promise. The food shortage was becoming acute, and people were beginning to starve. Tetty's anxiety increased daily, and she realised that the only hope of their surviving was to leave Prague and make for her brother Jakob's farm. Sooner or later, someone would surely find out where they were hiding. She suspected that many already knew. She thought of Yannick and tried to remember where he and Hals did their night patrol. She dared not meet him at the gate, and knew she would be placing his life in danger. She would have to leave Suzannah alone, possibly for several hours, and she never knew when there would be people, hungry as themselves, searching the garden for edible plants. "Lie still, Suzannah, here, under the blanket, and don't move or make a sound. I'm coming back. Just be quiet." And the little dog lay still and hidden for hours, waiting for Tetty's return. She did manage eventually to find Yannick, and, in spite of the danger and need for secrecy, met for long enough to make a plan. Yannick pointed out that Suzannah, even as a puppy, had shown a remarkable instinct for finding a way through the forests where she and Ola had played. She was sure that even in pitch darkness, if they made it to the wood, she could lead Tetty out and join the main road 30 miles north of the city. The real problem was the roadblocks, which were manned by military police and dogs. "Have you any papers?" "No, none." "But there's a way out with only one check before the road skirts to the forest, and I'll try to be posted there with Hals. Can you carry Suzannah?" he asked. "Yes, she's so thin now." "You must roll her in a blanket and carry her over your shoulders like a bundle of washing. Do you think she'll keep still?" "She will if I tell her." "Put a thick shawl over your head, and I'll keep Hals quiet. Be ready to leave at any time."
Come on the night you find 2 flat stones at the gate, and just after midnight, when the guard changes." And he disappeared into the dark. Tetty looked in vain for more than a week. They were desperately cold and hungry, and she agonised that perhaps Yannick was in trouble and unable to carry out the plan. But at last the stones were in place, and Tetty trembled as she waited for the night to come. She wrapped Suzannah in a thick blanket, and after months and months of hiding, Suzannah knew they were again in danger and that she must play her part. "Keep still, Suzannah," Tetty whispered as they came in sight of the roadblock. Yannick and Hals were there, but to her horror, a young German soldier strolled up to stand with them, stamping his feet in the cold, looking for any diversion to relieve the boredom of a night patrol. He saw Tetty. "Why are you out so late, old woman? Don't you know there's a curfew?" he shouted. "My sister is dying. She lives just here in the forest." "What's in your bundle?" "I'm taking her a blanket." "Bring it here, we're cold too." But as he put up his hand to grab the blanket, Hals leapt forward, snarling and growling. The young soldier stepped back. He was angry, but did not want to risk shooting a good guard dog for an argument with an old woman over a blanket. "Go now," whispered Yannick. "Don't run, but walk fast." He turned to speak to the soldier, shrugging his shoulders, laughing and joking. He had seen the man's hand fly to his revolver and remain there. He knew that even now Hals might be shot. "He was growling at the old woman, you see. He only likes them young and ooh-la-la." And he described a curvaceous bust with both hands. The men laughed loudly at the age-old joke, and Yannick turned deliberately so that the young soldier had his back to the road. It was only Hals who watched Tetty walk steadily along the road, then turn suddenly and make for the forest and disappear into the darkness. His head up, ears alert and tense in every muscle, his eyes looked wistful. He knew Tetty and understood perfectly well that Suzannah was in that blanket, but he would have loved to have seen his little friend. He'd keep an eye on that young soldier, but for most of the night he stared at the road where Tetty and Suzannah had vanished. Tetty, her knees weak with fear, staggered on into the darkness and reached the safety of the trees. Suzannah, released from the blanket, was delighted to be free and gave Tetty a great welcome, wagging her tail and licking her hands. "You never give up, Suzannah, my little brave one. And now you must lead us through miles and miles of forest track." The darkness was as thick as pitch, and Tetty stumbled and almost fell many times over. Suzannah walked 2 paces in front of her, and Tetty hoped and prayed that she was following what she was being told. Tetty spoke clearly, repeating the phrases. "The school camp, Suzannah. Remember, the camp. And now listen, Suzannah, the hunting lodge. Remember the wild boar hunt. Now the river, Suzannah. The bridge. Take us to the bridge." When Tetty heard the stream, she fell to her knees and hugged her. They drank and rested and washed in the freezing water. "This is better than that filthy cellar, Suzannah." They straggled on all through the night, every snick of a twig cracking, every creak or groan made by the pine trees shook Tetty like a rifle shot and had her quivering and clinging to Suzannah. This forest used to be teeming with deer and wild boar, thought Tetty, but there was no sign now of another living creature. All had been trapped or shot by a starving population. When the sky lightened into the pale wintry dawn, Tetty knew they were heading north, as she had prayed and hoped. Suzannah had led them through the forest. But the little dog was exhausted,
and collapsed on her side, unable to move. Tetty realised with anguish that they would have to stop. They shared the last piece of bread, and wrapped in the blanket on the mattress of pine needles, they both slept. There was another terrible night of walking along the edge of the main road leading north. Without the protection of the tall trees, the cold was even more severe. They hid in ditches whenever a military vehicle passed, huddled together, frightened of being caught in the headlights. Once, a lorry stopped just ahead of them, and for a minute, Tetty thought they had been seen. On the second morning, they arrived at the farm, both scarcely able to take another step. They were filthy, starving, and exhausted. Tetty's brother Jakob was appalled when he saw her. "Are you insane to bring that dog, Tetty? I can't even feed the children. The Germans come in every day and take the eggs and milk. They count every cabbage and there's no meat. They export our food to Germany. They will shoot her. They shot our dogs. Don't you understand?" Tetty, in tears, explained about her promise to Ola. "Besides, she's a clever little dog and will catch rats in the barns. And I love her, Jacob. She has made me go on living. I would have died without her. She's so sensible and cheerful. Jacob, please help us. In time, you will love her too." Tetty was right. Suzannah's magic worked as always, and sad to have lost their own dogs, she was soon everyone's favourite. She adopted Jacob's children at once, and would stay with them even ignoring Tetty's calls, and they were soon equally devoted to her. She loved their games, and would join in everything as indeed she had with Ola. They kept up a constant watch for the soldiers, and hid her in every conceivable place. The hayloft, the woodpile, even Jacob's bed. Anywhere. After a few months, Jakob confessed that he would rather die than give her up. "She's our mascot, and we'll do everything in the world to keep her safe." No one on the farm ever betrayed her. Compared with the years spent in the cellar, this was a good time for Suzannah. She liked having people around, and the children were her joy. She seemed not to be unhappy. Only poor Tetty was worn down by the work on the farm. Her back was bent, and she had to walk with a stick. "If I have to help with another harvest," she thought, "I shall be unable to stand up, as my back will be broken." The war was grinding to a terrible end for the Germans, and defeat was becoming inevitable. Little news got through to the farm, but even there rumours of unspeakable Nazi atrocities were being openly discussed. It seemed they had set up prison camps, and Tetty, who had had no word of the Munkers for 5 years, was filled with a terrible dread. Her mind skimmed around, but refused to face the probability that they were dead. But Tetty felt somehow that Suzannah was still waiting for Ola. She couldn't explain it, but the feeling was real. "I think you're waiting for Ola," she said to her one day. Suzannah climbed onto Tetty's lap and, sitting bolt upright, opened her eyes wide and seemed to be listening for something. "She will be grown up now, nearly 18, and you and I have become old ladies. My hair is white, and look at your little white face, Suzannah. She won't know us, will she?" And they kept on waiting. One monumentous day, when the war was officially ended, but Europe was still in turmoil, a letter came at last. It was brought by the driver of a Red Cross medical supplies lorry, and had been written by Ola from a hospital in Prague, where it seemed she had been struggling to come back to life for several months. Tetty's joy turned to horror as she read of the prison camp where she had been held with other suspected Czech traitors near the Polish border. They had managed reasonably well at first. Her parents had been more bored and frustrated than afraid. Ola had sung for everyone, even the Czech guards, and Dr. Munka had helped her to memorize the arias of several Mozart operas and coached her in music theory. They had found a photograph in Dr. Munka's wallet of Suzannah taken in Austria the previous summer. "I have kept it with me for every moment of every day," she wrote. By the end of the second year, things had got worse. The Czech guards were replaced by special German prison officers, and the horror and degradation had begun. The overcrowding increased as more so-called traitors arrived. They were herded together, men, women, and children, in primitive huts, filthy, famished, and sick. Ola had not realized that the food her parents said they had saved for her was all they had. They were dying in order to keep her alive. The end had come last winter, when they had died within weeks of each other, frozen to death in their beds. Ola, stricken and desperate, had struggled on alone. For months she had befriended 2 younger children. She had told them endless stories about Suzannah and the joy she had brought. They would peep at her picture, and Ola had tried so hard to comfort and care for them. But they too, the little poor ones, had died in her arms, and Ola's heart was broken. All I had left, Tetty, was Suzannah's picture, so creased from being folded into a minute square to keep it hidden from the guards. I'm longing to see you both. Do you think Suzannah will remember me? I am so excited I can hardly write. I hope she will remember me. I have never doubted that she is alive. I used to say to her picture, Suzannah, stay alive for me, and if I survive, it will be to see you. Somehow, she always answers me. Within days, Ola arrived at the farm. Tetty was amazed to find herself embracing a pale, thin girl who clung to her, weeping. There is a lifetime between 12 and 17, and she would not have known her. Ola, you are so tall. Tetty, where is Suzannah? Come, Suzannah, come. Where is she, Tetty? But Suzannah was nowhere to be seen. Incredibly, she had run away to hide. They found her cowering and trembling behind a sofa in another room. Nothing would coax her to come out. She's forgotten me, Tetty. Oh, Tetty, she doesn't remember. She thinks I'm a stranger and she's afraid. Ola sat down and wept. But suddenly they heard a strange whimpering that grew to an eerie wail. They sat frozen in their chairs as, slowly at first, Suzannah came through the door. She was squealing and whining, writhing across the floor on her belly like a snake. Her teeth were snapping and chattering, with her lips pulled back as if she were trying to smile. She reached Ola and paused, then put back her head and howled 3 times. It was not quite a scream, but a sound terrible and unearthly, unlike any sound ever heard before. It was a cry of grief and terror, of anguish and death. It was the sound of all the sadness of life that was ever lived. It was Suzannah's lament for the suffering that was past. And then there was silence as she lay trembling at Ola's feet. What is it, my little Suzannah? What is it with you? Said Ola softly. I'm here now. Come to me. Slowly, the little dog climbed onto her beloved mistress's lap, and at last her trembling ceased. So, that is the story of my little Suzannah.
and that is why I had to buy one of your toys." She turned to leave, smiling through her tears. "Yes, but what about Suzannah?" I caught her sleeve, struggling with my own tears, unwilling to let her go. "We had some more happy years. I stayed on at the farm with Tetty, and Suzannah was very old at the end. But she had a good life, my little dog. She had a golden heart, and that was her magic. There was always someone to love her. I came to study music in England, and I have managed my life in spite of the war. Suzannah saved me, and I will never forget her. And neither, I thought, will I. One day I will write her story so that her magic will be remembered."